When a scarred schoolteacher arrives in Montana as a mail-order bride only to be cruelly rejected upon sight, she must build a new life in a frontier town that judges her worth by appearance alone. In The Worth of Eleanor Gray, one woman's journey from rejection to belonging reveals the transformative power of seeing beyond surface imperfections. But will she ever find someone who truly sees her? The whistle screamed as the train lurched to a stop, sending Eleanor Gray stumbling against her seat. Outside the window, a sign swinging from a single nail read, Silver Creek, Montana, her final destination after 3 days of travel. Her stomach knotted with both hunger and fear. What would he think when he saw her face? Eleanor rose on trembling legs, her spine straight as the schoolteacher she'd been until 2 weeks ago. The other passengers, a cattle buyer and a young married couple, hurried past without a glance. She was used to being invisible. Sometimes that hurt less than being seen. The November wind slapped her cheeks the moment she stepped onto the wooden platform. Her threadbare coat, once her mother's, now faded from black to gray, did little against the Montana cold. Her fingers, red and chapped, clutched a worn leather valise containing everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, a nightgown, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a small painting of her parents. Last stop Silver Creek. All out, the conductor shouted, already turning back to his duties without waiting to see if she needed help. Eleanor tucked a strand of mousy brown hair behind her ear, accidentally revealing what she typically tried to hide, the jagged scar that ran from her right temple to the corner of her mouth. The mark from the childhood fever that nearly killed her had also killed her chances at marriage back east. At 32, she'd been firmly on the shelf until Mr. James Hartford's advertisement caught her eye. Successful merchant seeks educated bride of good character for companionship and household management. She had been honest in her letters, mentioning her scar, but emphasizing her skills, 8 years teaching at Philadelphia's Fairmont School for Girls. Accomplished at piano, fluent in French. Mr. Hartford's replies had seemed eager, even warm. Character matters more than appearance, he'd written in his 3rd letter. Those words had given her hope enough to spend nearly all her savings on the train ticket west. The platform boards creaked beneath her boots as Eleanor scanned the small station, little more than a wooden shack with peeling paint. Steam from the locomotive hissed around her ankles like ghostly snakes. For people waited near the station door, but none approached her. A well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard stood slightly apart from the others. He held a pocket watch, checking it before scanning the few passengers who had stepped off the train. His eyes passed over Eleanor once, twice, then returned with a barely disguised flinch that sent ice through her veins. She knew that look, had seen it countless times before. "Miss Gray?" he called, approaching with hesitation in his steps. "Eleanor Gray?" She swallowed hard, forcing a smile that pulled uncomfortably at her scar. "Mr. Hartford, I presume?" His eyes darted to her scar, then quickly away as if burned. "Yes, welcome to Silver Creek." He made no move to take her valise. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the train's departing whistle. Eleanor's heart pounded in her ears. This moment, this first meeting, would determine her entire future. She'd left everything behind. There was nowhere to go if this failed. "Your journey was comfortable, I hope?" Mr. Hartford finally asked, his gaze fixed somewhere above her left shoulder. "As comfortable as 3 days on a train can be," Eleanor replied, trying to sound lighthearted though her mouth had gone dry. Mr. Hartford nodded stiffly. "Silver Creek isn't much compared to Philadelphia, but we have the essentials. The general store carries goods from as far as Chicago. I look forward to seeing it all," she said, still clutching her valise with white knuckles. Would he ever look directly at her face? "This way," he said, turning without offering his arm. As they left the station, Eleanor caught the whispers from the small cluster of onlookers. "That's Hartford's mail-order bride? Lord have mercy. Didn't he say she was a schoolteacher? Pretty dress won't fix that face." Eleanor kept her head high, though each word landed like a pebble against her back. She'd endured worse in Philadelphia's drawing rooms. At least here, she told herself, she might still have a chance. Mr. Hartford had known about her scar. He'd written that character mattered more than appearance. But as they walked side by side down Silver Creek's main street, him a careful foot away from her, Eleanor wondered if words and letters meant anything at all when faced with the reality of her marked face. A gunshot cracked the morning air, jolting Eleanor from uneasy sleep. She rushed to the window of Mr. Hartford's guest room, heart racing, only to see a man shooting at a snake near the water pump. Life was different here, wilder, more dangerous than Philadelphia's ordered streets. She hadn't slept well. After their silent walk yesterday, Mr. Hartford had shown her to this small but clean room, muttering something about discussing arrangements after you've rested. His eyes had avoided her face entirely. Eleanor splashed water from the basin onto her face, patting carefully around her scar. 8 years of teaching had taught her that appearing confident, even when she wasn't, helped others feel at ease. Today she would need all her courage. Downstairs, the smell of coffee and bacon made her empty stomach growl. A young woman, barely 20, with blonde curls escaping her cap, jumped when Eleanor entered the kitchen. "Oh, you startled me, miss. I'm Jenny, Mr. Hartford's housekeeper. There's coffee if you'd like." Her eyes darted to Eleanor's scar before quickly looking away. "Thank you, Jenny," Eleanor said, pouring herself a cup with hands that only slightly trembled. "Is Mr. Hartford at breakfast?" "He's in his study. Said to tell you he'll see you there when you're ready." Jenny busied herself with pots, clearly uncomfortable. The house was impressive by frontier standards, a 2-story clapboard structure with real glass windows and white lace curtains. As Eleanor moved through the hallway, she noticed photographs on the wall. Mr. Hartford shaking hands with important-looking men, standing proudly in front of his store, even one with the governor, according to the frame's inscription. She found him at his desk, writing in a ledger. The study smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, with bookshelves holding more volumes than she'd expected to find in a frontier town. Mr. Hartford closed his ledger when she entered but didn't stand. "Miss Gray," he acknowledged. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, thank you," she lied, standing because he hadn't offered her a seat. Her teacher's posture, back straight, shoulders back, helped her feel less vulnerable. He cleared his throat, tapping his fingers against the desktop. "I've been considering our situation." Eleanor's heart sank. There it was, that tone. The same voice the headmistress had used when explaining why Eleanor couldn't be permitted to teach the advanced classes despite her qualifications. It was the voice people used when rejecting her as gently as their discomfort allowed. "Please speak frankly," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. Mr. Hartford finally looked at her, a quick, full-face glance before his eyes dropped to his desk. "Your letters were eloquent. You described yourself as plain, but—" He paused, his discomfort evident. "I find I cannot proceed with our arrangement." Though expected since the moment she'd seen his flinch at the train station, the words stung like a physical blow. "I see. You seem a decent woman, and I've no wish to cause offense. But a man in my position—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely to the photographs on his wall. "Appearances matter in business. My store caters to the finest families in the territory. My wife would be expected to host gatherings, to help secure contracts." Eleanor's fingernails bit into her palms, but her face remained composed. 8 years of schoolgirl's casual cruelty had taught her never to show pain. "What do you propose, Mr. Hartford? I've spent nearly all I had on the journey here." Relief flooded his features at her businesslike tone. "I've arranged for a room at Mrs. Talbot's boarding house for 2 weeks. That should give you time to make other arrangements." He opened a drawer and removed an envelope. "This will cover your expenses." The envelope felt heavy in her hand, charity, not obligation. "And if I find no position in 2 weeks?" Hartford stood, straightening his waistcoat. "Silver Creek is growing. Perhaps the mine office needs a clerk, or the school might." He stopped, seeming to realize a scarred face might be no more welcome teaching children than greeting store customers. "I appreciate your consideration," Eleanor said, the words tasting like ash. An hour later, Mr. Hartford's housekeeper drove Eleanor to Mrs. Talbot's boarding house in a small wagon. Jenny chattered nervously the entire way about nothing of consequence, while Eleanor sat silent, the envelope of money heavy in her pocket. Main Street was busier now than during yesterday's arrival. Men in dusty work clothes mixed with women in calico dresses and children darting between wagons. Several people stared openly at Eleanor. A young boy pointed before his mother slapped his hand down. When they arrived, Mrs. Talbot, a thin, sharp-featured woman in a spotless apron, stood waiting on the porch steps. Mr. Hartford had clearly sent word ahead. "This is Miss Gray," Jenny explained, helping with the valise. Mr. Hartford arranged for her to stay 2 weeks. Mrs. Talbot's eyes lingered on Eleanor's scar. "Yes, he sent a note. Come along then." The boarding house smelled of lye soap and yesterday's cabbage. For closed doors lined the downstairs hallway. "For my regular gentleman boarders," Mrs. Talbot explained, while Eleanor was shown to a small room beneath the eaves. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6, Mrs. Talbot recited flatly. "No gentlemen visitors in rooms. Laundry day is Tuesday." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. When the door closed behind Mrs. Talbot, she sank onto the narrow bed, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. The room held a bed, washstand, and single chair. Wind whistled through a gap in the window frame. On the wall hung a faded sampler. "The Lord is my shepherd." The irony wasn't lost on her. Eleanor had felt like a lost sheep for most of her life, tolerated for her mind but rejected for her face. Philadelphia had at least offered the school, where her teaching abilities earned respect if not acceptance. Here she was utterly alone. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her parents' small portrait on the washstand. Her father had been a professor, her mother a minister's daughter. Both had died of influenza when Eleanor was 18, leaving her to make her own way. They would be heartbroken to see her now, discarded like damaged goods after a journey of 2,000 miles. That night, as wind rattled the window panes and unfamiliar sounds drifted up from the street, a distant piano from the saloon, men's laughter, a dog's persistent barking, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and fought back tears. What other arrangements could possibly exist for a woman like her in this remote town? Return east was impossible with her limited funds. Becoming a housekeeper would require someone willing to have her strange face in their home daily. Teaching? Perhaps, if the town was desperate enough. She fingered the envelope of Hartford's money, shame and anger warring within her. Pride demanded she return it. Survival required she keep it. From the next room, she heard the muffled sounds of someone crying a woman, by the softness of it. Eleanor wasn't the only person lying awake with troubles tonight. She turned toward the wall, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. One day at a time. That's how she had survived after her parents died. After the school's headmistress had relegated her to teaching only the youngest girls. After each small humiliation that scarred her heart as deeply as fever had marked her face. Tomorrow she would explore Silver Creek. She would find her place here or create one. James Hartford wasn't the first man to find her wanting. And if Eleanor had learned anything in her 32 years, it was that survival sometimes meant building a life from the pieces others discarded. A chicken squawked and darted between Eleanor's skirts as she stepped from Mrs. Talbot's boarding house into the bright morning sunlight. Her stomach growled. She'd skipped breakfast to avoid the curious stares of other boarders who'd heard about Hartford's latest disappointment. 3 copper pennies jingled in her pocket, all that remained of her travel money. Enough for bread, perhaps, but not much else. In 7 days, even her paid lodging would end, leaving her truly adrift in this unfamiliar frontier town. Miss, are you a teacher?" The small voice startled Eleanor from her worried thoughts. A girl of perhaps 10 years, with fiery red braids and a constellation of freckles across her nose, stood on the boardwalk clutching a worn McGuffey reader to her chest. "I was," Eleanor replied, surprised by the direct question. "In Philadelphia." The girl's face lit up like a lantern. "I knew it. You have that look about you, like you know important things. I'm Abigail Cooper, but everyone calls me Abby. Our teacher, Mrs. Peterson, Left last month when her husband took sick back east. Now we just have Pastor Williams 3 mornings a week, and he mostly just makes us recite Bible verses and falls asleep in his chair. Eleanor couldn't help smiling at the girl's forthright manner. That's hardly a complete education. That's what my pa says too. Abby glanced around conspiratorially before continuing in a hushed tone. He's the blacksmith, Mr. Cooper, and he taught me to read himself, but he says there's a lot he doesn't know about teaching proper, especially mathematics and geography. Did you teach those subjects in Philadelphia? I taught everything from basic letters to algebra and natural philosophy, Eleanor replied, finding herself charmed by the child's enthusiasm. In Philadelphia, parents often pulled their children from her classroom upon seeing her face, fearing her scar might frighten the little ones. Natural philosophy? Is that about trees and such? It's about understanding how the world works. Why apples fall down instead of up, why ice floats on water, how birds can fly. Abby's eyes widened. You know why birds can fly? Pa just says it's because God made them that way, which is true enough I suppose, but doesn't explain the how of it. Your father sounds like a thoughtful man. Abby nodded vigorously, her braids bouncing. He is. The smartest in town, even if he didn't go to school much. She tilted her head, studying Eleanor's face. Her gaze direct but not unkind, and notably without the usual flinch at her scar. Why are you here? Nobody just comes to Silver Creek unless they're looking for something. Eleanor's hand instinctively rose to touch her scar, then dropped away. This child's directness deserved honesty. I was to meet someone, but the arrangement didn't suit. You mean Mr. Hartford? At Eleanor's startled look, Abby shrugged. It's a small town. Everyone knows everyone's business before sundown. He brings ladies from back east sometimes, but they never stay. Pa says he's too concerned with putting on airs to recognize a good heart when he sees one. A blush warmed Eleanor's cheeks. Your father sounds wise indeed. He is, he says. Abby stopped mid-sentence, her attention caught by something across the street. Oh, there he is now. Pa, over here. A deep voice called out, Abigail Cooper, are you bothering the lady? Eleanor turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man crossing the muddy street with long strides, dodging a passing wagon with practiced ease. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years at the forge. Unlike most people she'd encountered, he looked directly at her face without his eyes immediately darting away from her scar. His own face bore marks of its own. A strong, weathered countenance with a beard peppered with gray despite his apparent middle years, and a burned scar that covered much of his left hand and disappeared beneath his rolled sleeve. I'm not bothering her, Pa. She's a teacher from Philadelphia. She knows why birds can fly. A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes as he removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. Samuel Cooper, ma'am. I apologize if my daughter's been imposing with her questions. Once she starts asking, it's hard to stem the tide. Eleanor Gray. She extended her hand, which he took with surprising gentleness for such large hands. No glove separated their touch, unusual for a first meeting, but the frontier had different rules. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. And your daughter hasn't been imposing at all. It's refreshing to speak with someone who appreciates education. My Abby's sharp as a tack. Pride warmed his voice. Reads everything she can get her hands on. Been trying to convince the town council to hire a proper teacher since Mrs. Peterson left. His eyes, a deep, steady blue like mountain lakes, held Eleanor's gaze without wavering. You planning to stay in Silver Creek, Miss Gray? The question hung between them, full of unexpected possibility. For the first time since stepping off the train, Eleanor felt a flutter of hope in her chest. I hadn't planned to, she admitted. But my circumstances have changed. Circumstances have a way of doing that, Samuel said, a note of understanding in his voice that suggested he knew something of unexpected life changes himself. Silver Creek might not look like much compared to Philadelphia, but it's a good place for fresh starts. Abby tugged at her father's sleeve. Pa, Miss Gray needs a job, and we need a teacher. It's like in those math problems, if one person needs something and another person has it, they should trade. Samuel chuckled, the sound rich and warm. Life's not always as neat as arithmetic, little spark. He turned his attention back to Eleanor. Though my daughter has a point. The town council meets Thursday evenings. If you're interested, I could mention your qualifications. Eleanor hesitated. Teaching again. The thought filled her with both longing and dread. In Philadelphia, parents had eventually accepted her presence in the classroom, but it had taken months to overcome their initial wariness of her appearance. Would the people of Silver Creek be more accepting, or would she face the same struggle? Think on it, Samuel said, seeming to read her hesitation. No need to decide this minute. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded handbill. Town's having a social at the church tonight. Might help you get the lay of the land before making any decisions. Their fingers brushed as she accepted the paper, sending an unexpected tingle up her arm. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Samuel, he corrected with a smile. Folks don't stand on ceremony much out here. Then thank you, Samuel. Abby bounced on her toes. Will you come to the social, Miss Gray? There'll be pie and singing, and Mrs. Hollister plays the fiddle something wonderful. Before Eleanor could answer, the church bell began to toll, marking the hour. Land's sakes, I'm late, Abby exclaimed. Pastor Williams gives extra verses if you're tardy. She darted forward impulsively and squeezed Eleanor's hand. Please come tonight. Please. With that, she dashed away, red braids flying behind her like banners in the wind. Samuel watched his daughter go with fond exasperation. That girl moves in two speeds, asleep or running. He turned back to Eleanor, his expression growing more serious. Miss Gray, might I speak plainly? Eleanor braced herself. Here it came. Some polite comment about her face, some gentle suggestion that she might be better off returning east. I know why you came to Silver Creek, he said quietly. And I know what happened with Hartford. He's done the same to other women. Writes pretty letters, then turns them away when they don't match whatever picture he's painted in his mind. Shame burned in Eleanor's chest. News travels fast. Too fast sometimes, Samuel agreed. But here's what the gossips might not tell you. Silver Creek needs educated people, especially those willing to teach. If you're considering staying, you'd have my support with the council. Eleanor studied him, searching for pity in his expression and finding none, only straightforward honesty. Why would you help a stranger? Because 8 years ago my Jane died of childbed fever, leaving me with a 2-year-old daughter and no notion of how to raise her proper, he said simply. This town helped us when we needed it most. Paying that forward seems right. The church bell finished its tolling, leaving a silence between them filled with unspoken possibilities. In that moment, Eleanor saw not just one potential path before her, but many, each leading to a future she hadn't dared imagine when she'd boarded the train in Philadelphia with a marriage contract in her valise. The social starts at 7, Samuel said, settling his hat back on his head. Hope to see you there, Miss Gray. As he walked away, Eleanor unfolded the handbill in her hands. Silver Creek Community Social. It proclaimed in bold letters. All welcome, all welcome. Such simple words. Yet they kindled something in her chest she'd thought long extinguished, belonging. What if Silver Creek could become more than just another stopping point in a life of constant movement? What if, against all odds, it could become home? The church social buzzed with activity. Fiddle music lilting from the corner. Tables laden with pies and cakes. Children darting between clusters of adults who chatted in the golden lamplight. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, fingers clutching her shawl. She'd spent the afternoon pressing her second-best dress with Mrs. Talbot's flat iron, but still felt woefully underprepared for such a gathering. You came. Abby's delighted voice cut through Eleanor's panic as the girl appeared at her side, grabbing her hand. Pa said you might, but I wasn't sure. Come meet everybody. Before Eleanor could protest, Abby pulled her into the crowded room. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Eyes lingered on her scar before politely shifting away. Everyone. This is Miss Gray from Philadelphia. Abby announced with proprietary pride. She's a teacher and knows ever so many things, like why birds can fly and how to do algebra. An awkward silence followed before a plump woman in a green calico dress stepped forward, hand outstretched. Mary Hollister, Miss Gray. Welcome to Silver Creek. Don't mind this lot. We don't get many new faces out here, especially educated ones. Thank you, Eleanor managed, relief washing through her as other women joined Mrs. Hollister, introducing themselves with varying degrees of warmth. The men kept a respectful distance, tipping their hats from across the room. Ladies, don't crowd the poor woman before she's even had a slice of pie. Samuel Cooper's voice cut through the chatter as he approached, carrying 2 plates. Miss Gray, I recommend Mrs. Hollister's apple crumble. Nothing finer this side of the Mississippi. The circle of women parted, several exchanging knowing glances that Eleanor pretended not to notice. Samuel looked different tonight. His work clothes exchanged for clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his beard neatly trimmed, his hair slicked back with what smelled faintly of bay rum. Mr. Cooper, she acknowledged, accepting the offered plate. Your daughter has been kind enough to introduce me around. Abby's never met a stranger, he said with a fond smile as the girl dashed off to join a group of children her age. Come sit. The music's about to start, and that bench by the windows got the best view. As they settled onto the wooden bench, Eleanor became acutely aware of the roomful of eyes watching their interaction. Small towns, she knew, thrived on gossip, and a scarred Eastern spinster talking with the widowed blacksmith would provide ample fodder. Don't mind them, Samuel said quietly, seeming to read her thoughts. They mean well, mostly. Been trying to marry me off since Jane passed, especially the ones with unmarried daughters or sisters. Eleanor felt a strange twinge at the thought of Samuel being matched with some fresh-faced frontier girl. I'm sure you have no shortage of prospects. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. Prospects, maybe. Interest on my part, no. His gaze drifted to where Abby sat with the other children, heads bent over some game involving pebbles and a chalk circle. Been focused on raising her right. Haven't given much thought to remarrying. The fiddle struck up a lively reel, and several couples took to the cleared space in the center of the room. Samuel's foot tapped in time to the music. Do you dance, Miss Gray? Not in many years, she admitted, and not since the fever that had left her scarred. The same fever that had taken her parents and left her alone in the world at 17. He nodded, seeming to understand the weight behind her simple statement. Nor I. Jane loved dancing. Couldn't get enough of it. A shadow crossed his face, then cleared. Heard you met with Mayor Fleming this afternoon. The abrupt change of subject startled her. News travels fast here. Like wildfire in August, he agreed. He mentioned the teaching position? He did. Eleanor set her empty pie plate aside. He said the council meets Thursday to discuss it formally. Samuel's expression grew serious. Fleming's a good man, but he's 1 vote of 5. Hartford's another, and he's made his opinions of you clear enough. Mr. Hartford believes my appearance would disturb the children, Eleanor said flatly, voicing the fear that had haunted her since arriving in Silver Creek. Hartford's a fool, Samuel replied, his voice rough with sudden anger. Children are the least judgmental people on God's earth until adults teach them otherwise. He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its careful arrangement. Sorry. Man just gets under my skin sometimes with his Eastern airs. Eleanor found herself touched by his indignation on her behalf. It's a reasonable concern, Mr. Cooper. In Philadelphia, parents often removed their children from my class when they saw my face. The school board eventually moved me to a position teaching older students who were less easily frightened. Were they? Samuel asked quietly. Frightened? Or was that just what the adults assumed? The question caught her off guard. I don't know. The younger ones sometimes stared or asked questions, but they weren't afraid. It was their parents who objected. Children see with clearer eyes sometimes. His gaze met hers directly, unfaltering. My Abby saw a teacher. Nothing more, nothing less. The music shifted to a slower waltz. Across the room, Eleanor noticed Mr. Hartford watching them, his expression disapproving. Beside him stood a severe-looking woman in an expensive dress, whispering behind her fan while glancing in their direction. "Who is that woman with Mr. Hartford?" Eleanor asked. "Widow Hargrove, his sister-in-law. Runs the Ladies' Aid Society and half the town with it." Samuel's voice held a note of wariness. "She's got a son about 16 who could use proper schooling. Bright boy, but headstrong. You think she'd object to me teaching him?" Samuel considered the question. "Hard to say. She's from Boston originally, has definite ideas about propriety. But she's also practical. Boy needs education if he's to take over his late father's business someday." A commotion near the refreshment table interrupted their conversation. A lanky young man had knocked over the punch bowl, sending a crimson flood across the tablecloth and onto the floor. Women scrambled to contain the mess while the culprit stammered apologies. "Thomas Hargrove," Samuel explained with a sigh. "Speak of the devil. Good heart but all elbows and knees these days. Growing too fast for his own good." Eleanor watched as Widow Hargrove berated her son in hushed but clearly furious tones. The boy, nearly a man, towered over his mother physically but seemed to shrink under her sharp words. "He's at that difficult age," Eleanor observed. "Too old for children's lessons but not yet settled into manhood. Exactly the sort who needs guidance from someone who understands book learning," Samuel replied meaningfully. "Someone who could prepare him for university, perhaps." The implication was clear. If Eleanor could win over Widow Hargrove through her son, she would gain a powerful ally on the town council. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself drawn into conversation with various townspeople. Mrs. Peterson's husband, recovering from his illness, spoke enthusiastically about his wife's teaching methods. The general store owner, Mr. Fairchild, lamented his inability to help his youngest daughter with her sums. Even Widow Hargrove approached briefly, sizing Eleanor up with shrewd eyes before asking pointed questions about her educational background. By the time the social wound down, Eleanor's head buzzed with names, faces, and the unexpected possibility that Silver Creek might have a place for her after all. Samuel and Abby walked her back to the boarding house, Abby skipping ahead to chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "You made quite an impression tonight," Samuel said. "Half the parents in town were asking if you might be our new teacher. And the other half?" His mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Wondering if you might be courting the blacksmith." Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks. "Mr. Cooper." "A joke, Miss Gray," he assured her, though something in his eyes suggested it wasn't entirely in jest. "Though folks will talk. It's been years since a single woman of appropriate age arrived in Silver Creek." They reached the boarding house steps, Abby still occupied with fireflies at the garden gate. "Miss Gray," Samuel began, then hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Eleanor, if I may, I have a proposition for you." She stiffened, suddenly wary. She'd heard propositions from men before, usually thinly veiled offers that assumed a scarred woman would be grateful for any male attention, no matter how improper. Seeing her expression, Samuel shook his head quickly. "Not that kind of proposition. Good Lord, I'd never." He took a breath, collecting himself. "The town council meets Thursday, 3 days from now. They'll vote on whether to hire you as teacher." "Yes," Mayor Fleming explained the process. "What he probably didn't explain is that Hartford is campaigning against you. Claims your condition would unsettle the children." A familiar pain twisted in Eleanor's chest. "I see. Fleming's on your side. So am I." "Peterson will vote with his wife's recommendation, and she seemed to take to you tonight. But Hargrove is the 5th vote, and she follows Hartford's lead more often than not. So I need to convince Mrs. Hargrove that I'm suitable to teach her son," Eleanor concluded. "Yes, but there's another matter." Samuel glanced toward the boarding house windows, where a curtain twitched, Mrs. Talbot no doubt watching for gossip material. He lowered his voice. "The teaching position comes with quarters, a small room attached to the schoolhouse. But it needs substantial repairs. Roof leaks, Stoves rusted through. Windows need reglazing. Repairs take money, Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning. Money I don't have. Exactly. Even if you're hired, you couldn't live there until it's fixed, which could take weeks. And Mrs. Talbot's rates, he trailed off diplomatically, are depleting what little savings I have left, Eleanor finished. So your proposition. Samuel squared his shoulders. I have a spare room. My sister lived with us until she married last spring. It's small but comfortable. You'd have privacy and proper accommodations. Eleanor blinked in surprise. You're offering me lodging? Not charity, he said quickly, pride evident in his voice. Abby needs tutoring to catch up with her studies, and I could use help with correspondence for the smithy. My handwriting's terrible, and there's orders to track and invoices to manage. Room and board in exchange for your services, until the school quarters are ready. She studied his face, searching for any sign of pity or ulterior motive, but found only straightforward practicality. Still, she hesitated. What would people say? A single woman living under your roof. They'll talk regardless, he replied with a pragmatic shrug. But having Abby in the house provides propriety enough. He paused, expression softening. Unless you'd prefer Mrs. Talbot's? I understand if you'd rather keep your distance. Eleanor thought of the boarding house's cold attic room, Mrs. Talbot's prying questions, and her rapidly dwindling funds. She thought of Abby's bright face and Samuel's steady gaze that never flinched from her scar. I accept your proposition, Mr. Cooper. Samuel, he corrected, a smile warming his weathered features. If we're to share a roof, we should use Christian names. Very well, Samuel. His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her both nervous and oddly comforted. Abby bounded up the steps, hands cupped around a captured firefly, its glow pulsing between her fingers. Look, Miss Gray, isn't it magical how they carry their own little lanterns? As Eleanor bent to admire the insect's gentle radiance, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, the first fragile tendril of belonging, like a seedling pushing through snow toward distant spring. The barn owl's screech pierced the frozen February night as Eleanor bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sweat dampened her nightgown despite the bitter cold that made frost patterns on her window. The nightmare again. Mr. Hartford's face twisting with disgust, a crowd pointing at her scar, the train whistle screaming as it left without her. She pressed trembling fingers against her cheek, tracing the raised line that had dictated so much of her life. A soft knock startled her. Miss Eleanor? Are you all right? Abby's voice came through the door, small with concern. Eleanor swallowed hard. Just a bad dream, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. But sleep remained elusive. By dawn, Eleanor had already dressed and descended to the kitchen, where she found Samuel stoking the cookstove. He looked up, his eyes narrowing at her appearance. Nightmares again? He asked quietly, handing her a steaming cup of coffee. She nodded, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm mug. They'll pass. You've made a home here, Samuel said, his voice rough with early morning. 3 months, and those children light up when you enter the schoolroom. Even Mrs. Peterson says you're the best teacher this town's ever had. The coffee warmed her from within, but Samuel's confidence in her did more to chase away the chill of her dreams. They'd established a comfortable routine in the modest house, Abby's cheerful chatter at breakfast, Samuel's steady presence, and Eleanor's growing sense that she belonged somewhere for the first time in her life. The schoolhouse bell rang across the snow-blanketed town just as red streaks of sunlight broke over the eastern hills. Another day of lessons, of young minds eager for knowledge, of purpose that had nothing to do with her appearance. Eleanor tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, no longer instinctively using the gesture to hide her scar. Miss Gray, Thomas Hargrove, her oldest student at 16, hurried toward her as she approached the schoolhouse. Tall and lanky with serious eyes, Thomas reminded Eleanor of herself at that age, hungry for knowledge that reached beyond the boundaries of Silver Creek. I finished that book you lent me, the Darwin one. Eleanor smiled. And what did you think? It's like seeing the world through new eyes. The way everything connects, how creatures change over time. His face shone with excitement. Pastor Williams says it's dangerous thinking, but I don't see how understanding God's creation better could be wrong. The pursuit of knowledge is never wrong, Thomas. But people fear what challenges their understanding of the world. She unlocked the schoolhouse door. We'll talk more after lessons. I've another book you might enjoy, Lyell's Principles of Geology. The day progressed smoothly until just after noon, when the temperature plunged so low that breath froze on scarves and beards. Eleanor had just begun the geography lesson, pointing out the major mountain ranges of the West, when the classroom door swung open with a bang that made several younger children jump in their seats. Mrs. Hargrove swept in, her black bombazine dress rustling like crow's wings, followed closely by Mr. Hartford. His eyes met Eleanor's for a brief moment before sliding away, as if the sight of her face still disturbed him after all these months. "We need a word, Miss Gray," Mrs. Hargrove announced, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. A hush fell over the classroom. Even little Sarah Miller, who could never sit still, froze with her slate pencil midair. Eleanor felt her stomach clench but kept her voice steady. "Children, please review the map of the Western Territories while I speak with our visitors." She led them into the small antechamber that served as her office, closing the door behind them. Mrs. Hargrove wasted no time. "It has come to our attention that you've been filling these children's heads with dangerous ideas. I teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography," Eleanor replied carefully. "The standard curriculum." Mr. Hartford produced a book from his coat pocket, the leather-bound copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species that Eleanor had lent to Thomas. "This was found in my nephew's possession. He claims you gave it to him." Thomas was Mrs. Hargrove's nephew? Eleanor hadn't made the connection. Her heart sank. She had indeed lent the book to Thomas, seeing in him a mind that craved challenge. "It's a scientific text, not inappropriate material. It contradicts scripture," Mrs. Hargrove snapped, color rising in her thin cheeks. "And worse, you're living in sin with the blacksmith while pretending to be a moral example for these children." The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "Mr. Cooper has provided lodging as a professional courtesy, with his daughter present as chaperone. There is nothing improper in our arrangement." "A convenient story," Mrs. Hargrove scoffed. "We all know why he took you in. A lonely widower with a young daughter needing a woman's touch. The question is why he hasn't made an honest woman of you." Eleanor felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. She and Samuel had developed a deep friendship, but neither had spoken of anything more. She valued his respect too much to assume he saw her as anything but a teacher for Abby and a lodger in need. "My relationship with Mr. Cooper is not the issue here," she said firmly. "We're discussing education." "They're connected," Mr. Hartford interjected, his voice smooth as oil. "A teacher must be above reproach. Your situation raises questions about your judgment." "My judgment?" Eleanor's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "What of your judgment, Mr. Hartford? You brought me here under false pretenses, then cast me aside because of my appearance. If anyone should question their moral compass, perhaps it should be you." A flash of something, shame, crossed Mr. Hartford's face before his expression hardened. "That's neither here nor there. The fact remains that you're teaching controversial material. Darwin's theories are discussed in universities across the country," Eleanor countered. "Thomas has a brilliant mind. He deserves exposure to modern scientific thought." "Nevertheless," Mr. Hartford said, straightening his waistcoat, "the council will be reviewing your position. In the meantime, you're to remove any controversial texts from the school's collection. And consider finding more appropriate lodging," Mrs. Hargrove added with a thin smile, "for propriety's sake." After they left, Eleanor stood alone in the small office, shaking with a mixture of anger and fear that left her lightheaded. Through the door, she could hear the children whispering, no doubt wondering what had happened. She pressed her palms against the rough wooden desk, trying to steady herself. The teaching position was more than employment. It was her place in this community, her purpose, her redemption after years of rejection and isolation. The thought of losing it, of proving Mr. Hartford right about her unsuitability, sent a wave of panic through her so strong she had to fight for breath. When school dismissed that afternoon, clouds heavy with snow had gathered, casting the town in premature twilight. Eleanor stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching as her students hurried home against the biting wind. Thomas lingered behind. "I'm sorry, Miss Gray," he said, his young face etched with guilt. "Aunt Millicent found the book in my room. I didn't think she'd be so angry." Eleanor managed a reassuring smile. "You've done nothing wrong, Thomas. Knowledge is never something to apologize for. But they might fire you because of me. If they do, it won't be because of you." She squeezed his shoulder. "Never stop asking questions, Thomas. That's how we grow." As Thomas trudged away through the deepening snow, Eleanor spotted Samuel waiting at the corner, collar turned up against the wind. Her heart gave an unexpected lurch at the sight of him. "Abby told me what happened," he said as she approached. "Walk with me." They moved in silence through the snow-covered town. Shopkeepers were closing early against the coming storm, shuttering windows and banking fires. The general store's owner, Mr. Finch, nodded respectfully as they passed, but Eleanor caught the curious glance he cast after them. News traveled fast in Silver Creek. Samuel led her not toward home but to the smithy. Dark now, the forge cold for the day. Inside, away from prying eyes, he lit a lantern. The golden light revealed a space that smelled of metal, leather, and wood smoke, smells that had become strangely comforting to Eleanor over the months. "They'll try to force me out," she said quietly, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Samuel ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing on end. "The town needs you. The children need you. You didn't hear what Mrs. Hargrove said about us." Eleanor couldn't meet his eyes. She implied impropriety. A muscle worked in Samuel's jaw. "Millicent Hargrove has been a bitter woman since her husband died. Takes pleasure in other people's misfortunes. But she's not alone in her thinking, is she?" Eleanor pressed. "People talk. Let them talk." Samuel's voice was low with anger. "You've done nothing wrong. What if that's not enough?" The question hung between them, laden with all her fears. Samuel turned away, moving to his workbench where various projects lay in different stages of completion. He picked up a piece of iron, misshapen, apparently discarded. "See this?" Tried to make a decorative hinge for the church doors, but the metal had flaws. Couldn't hold the pattern I wanted. He turned it over in his scarred hands, the lantern light catching on the ridged surface. Thought about melting it down, starting fresh, but then I saw something else in it. He turned back to Eleanor, eyes intent. "Those same qualities that made it wrong for one purpose make it perfect for another." He placed the iron in her hands. It had been reshaped into a delicate but sturdy bookmark, with a pattern that incorporated the metal's natural variations rather than fighting against them. Sometimes what the world sees as flaws are just distinctions. His calloused fingers brushed against hers as he closed her hand around the bookmark. "You belong here, Eleanor. Not despite who you are, but because of it." The weight of the iron bookmark in her palm felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to as the storm approached, both outside in the gathering blizzard and within her heart. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice stronger. Samuel's eyes, steady blue as the summer sky they hadn't yet seen together, held hers without flinching. "We fight. Not their way with gossip and backdoor dealings. Our way with honesty and work and showing this town what real strength looks like." Outside, the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, and the wind moaned around the eaves of the smithy. But inside, beside the banked forge with Samuel's determined face lit by lantern light, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope, warm and bright as the fires Samuel tended daily, transforming what others discarded into things of purpose and beauty. The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn silence. Eleanor jerked awake, heart pounding against her ribs. Another crash echoed through the house, followed by Abby's frightened cry. Without stopping for a shawl, Eleanor rushed from her room to find Samuel already in the hallway, pulling on his trousers. "Stay with Abby," he ordered, grabbing the rifle that hung above the kitchen door. Eleanor hurried to the girl's room instead, finding her huddled beneath her quilt. "What's happening?" Abby whispered, blue eyes wide with fear. "Just some mischief," Eleanor soothed, though her own hands trembled as Samuel's heavy footsteps crossed the porch outside. She heard his deep voice call out, followed by the sound of running feet crunching through frozen snow. When Samuel returned, his face was grim in the lamplight. "Someone threw rocks through the front windows. Left this." He held out a crumpled piece of paper. Scrawled in crude letters were the words, "Teacher, go home. We don't want your kind." Eleanor's fingers went cold as she took the note. "My kind. Educated women who challenge small minds," Samuel growled, setting the rifle back in its place with deliberate care. "Or people with scars on the outside instead of the inside, where cowards hide them." By morning, word of the attack had spread through Silver Creek. As Eleanor swept up broken glass, neighbors appeared, Mrs. Peterson with a fresh-baked pie, Mr. Finch from the general store carrying a new window pane, even old Dr. Wilson who rarely left his house in winter. "Don't you pay those fools any mind," Dr. Wilson told her, roomy eyes fierce behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Every town needs a good teacher more than it needs another batch of ignoramuses." The support warmed Eleanor, but couldn't entirely dispel her worry. The town hall meeting was scheduled for the first Friday in March, just 3 days away, where her future in Silver Creek would be decided. That afternoon, as children filed into the schoolhouse, Eleanor noticed whispers and sidelong glances. Thomas Hargrove approached her desk during the lunch hour, his lanky frame awkward with adolescent concern. "Miss Gray, there's talk in town. About the windows." Eleanor nodded. "I've heard. My aunt, Mrs. Hargrove, she's been saying things." He swallowed hard. "She says you'll corrupt us with your fancy Eastern ideas. That you're trying to turn us against God." "Do you believe that, Thomas?" He shook his head vigorously. "No, ma'am. You've shown me that asking questions doesn't mean giving up faith. It means understanding it better." His words stayed with Eleanor throughout the afternoon's lessons. As the children puzzled through fractions and geography, she found herself watching their faces. Earnest, curious, trusting. What would happen to them if she were forced to leave? Would their minds stay as open, as eager to explore beyond the boundaries of Silver Creek? After school, she was surprised to find Mr. Peterson waiting outside instead of Samuel. "Thought you might like company walking home," he said, falling into step beside her. "After what happened." "Thank you." A flock of crows rose from a nearby field, their harsh calls breaking the still air. "Your wife mentioned you've returned from the east." Mr. Peterson nodded, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Took sick visiting my mother in Boston. Pleurisy. Thought I'd die there, but somehow pulled through." He glanced at her. "Heard what you've done with the school while I was gone. Children talking about books I never heard of. Little Sarah Miller reading out loud at church socials. They're bright children. They just needed guidance. And structure," he agreed. "My Mary says you've given them both." He paused near the bridge that crossed the frozen creek. "There's talk you might be asked to leave." "More than talk," Eleanor admitted. "The council meets Friday." Mr. Peterson's weathered face tightened. "James Hartford and Millicent Hargrove making trouble, I suppose." He shook his head. "Those two have always believed they know what's best for everyone else. They believe I'm a bad influence. Because of that Darwin business?" "Shaw." He waved dismissively. "I read that book myself years ago at university. Didn't turn me into a heathen." Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. "You'll be at the meeting? Count on it." His smile revealed a missing tooth. "And I won't be the only one standing for you." That evening, as Eleanor helped Abby with her reading by lamplight, Samuel paced the kitchen floor, his footsteps heavy with anger. "This isn't just about books or boarding arrangements," he muttered. "Hartford's never forgiven you for staying in Silver Creek after he rejected you. Makes him look bad every time someone praises the new teacher." And Mrs. Hargrove? Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low so Abby wouldn't hear. Jealousy, Samuel said bluntly. Her nephew prefers your classroom to her parlor. Plus, she had hopes of matching her widowed sister with me before you came along. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. They hadn't spoken of marriage or courtship, yet something unspoken had grown between them, a connection deeper than friendship but undefined by either of them. What do we do? She asked. Fight. His blue eyes burned with determination. Show Silver Creek who you really are, not what Hartford and his cronies claim. For the next 2 days, Samuel put his plan into action. He invited parents to visit the schoolhouse during lessons, to see firsthand what their children were learning. Eleanor showcased student work, essays, arithmetic problems, maps they'd drawn, demonstrating the progress made in just 3 months. By Friday morning, Eleanor felt a cautious optimism. As she dressed for the town hall meeting in her best gray wool dress, the one Samuel had once said matched her eyes, she studied her reflection in the small mirror. The scar still ran from temple to lip, but somehow it seemed less prominent than it had when she'd first arrived in Silver Creek. Or perhaps she simply noticed it less. The town hall was already crowded when Eleanor, Samuel, and Abby arrived. Conversations hushed momentarily before resuming in whispers. Eleanor took a seat near the front, conscious of every eye upon her. Samuel's solid presence beside her steadied her nerves. Mayor Fleming, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers going gray, called the meeting to order. We're gathered to address concerns about the educational content being provided to our children. Mrs. Hargrove, you've raised this issue. Please state your case. Mrs. Hargrove rose, austere in black bombazine that crackled with each movement. Miss Gray has been exposing impressionable minds to controversial theories that contradict Christian teaching. Furthermore, her living situation with Mr. Cooper lacks proper supervision and sets a poor moral example. A murmur rippled through the room like wind through dry grass. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but kept her gaze steady, one hand clutching the iron bookmark in her pocket. The cool metal against her palm reminded her of Samuel's words. What some see as flaws, others recognize as distinction. Mr. Hartford spoke next, rising to his full height at the council table. His fine suit and polished boots marked him as Silver Creek's wealthiest citizen. When I first met Miss Gray, I had concerns about her suitability as a representative of our community. Her subsequent actions have only confirmed these concerns. That's rich coming from you, James? Called a voice from the back. Mr. Peterson, standing up despite his wife's tugging at his sleeve. Considering you brought her here under false pretenses. Mr. Hartford's neck flushed red above his starched collar. I made no promises I didn't intend to keep. Except you did. Samuel stood suddenly, his voice cutting through the rising commotion like a blacksmith's hammer through hot iron. You advertised for a bride, corresponded for months, then rejected Miss Gray upon sight, not for any fault of character, but because of a scar she disclosed in her letters. The room fell into stunned silence. Women exchanged shocked glances. Men stared at their boots. Is this true, James? Mayor Fleming asked, frowning beneath his bushy eyebrows. Mr. Hartford adjusted his waistcoat, clearly uncomfortable. My personal affairs are not the issue here. We're discussing educational standards and moral. They are the issue when you're questioning someone else's moral standing, Samuel countered, his voice steady but charged with emotion. He turned to address the room, meeting the gaze of parents whose children attended Eleanor's school. Miss Gray arrived here after being misled. Instead of slinking away east, she stayed and dedicated herself to our children's education. Judge her on that, not on gossip or old-fashioned notions about appearances. Mrs. Hargrove pushed to her feet again. No one is disputing the woman can teach reading and sums, she snapped. It's her modern ideas that concern us. Evolution, geology that contradicts Genesis. These are dangerous concepts for young minds. From the middle of the room, Dr. Wilson's gravelly voice rose. Knowledge isn't dangerous, Millicent. Ignorance is. I've watched too many patients die because folks clung to old ways instead of learning new ones. Another voice joined in, Mrs. Finch from the general store. My Billy couldn't write his name before Miss Gray came. Now he's reading adventure stories at bedtime. Eleanor felt something shifting in the room, like ice breaking up on the creek after a long winter. She rose slowly to her feet, trembling slightly but determined. Mayor Fleming, I'd like to speak. He nodded, seemingly relieved for a break in the back and forth. The floor is yours, Miss Gray. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. The scar on her face seemed to tingle under the scrutiny, but for once, she didn't mind. Let them see her, all of her. I came to Silver Creek expecting marriage, she began, her voice soft but clear in the hushed room. But I found something more valuable, purpose. These past months, I've watched your children grow in knowledge and confidence. Thomas Hargrove has discovered a passion for natural science. Little Sarah Miller can now read independently. Abby Cooper is writing essays that would impress any Eastern schoolmarm. She paused, gathering courage as she looked around the room, meeting the eyes of parents whose children sat in her classroom each day. Yes, I lent Thomas Darwin's book, not to undermine his faith, but to encourage critical thinking. A child who understands why he believes what he believes will hold those beliefs more firmly than one who accepts without question. Several heads nodded in agreement, including Pastor Williams, whose presence she hadn't noticed until now. As for my living arrangements, she continued, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, they have been nothing but proper. But if my residence with the Coopers troubles this community so deeply, I have a solution. She turned to face Samuel directly, the words coming from some well of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Mr. Cooper, would you do me the honor of becoming my husband? A collective gasp rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Eleanor heard someone, Mrs. Peterson, exclaim, "Well," in a tone of delighted scandal, but she kept her eyes fixed on Samuel's face, watching as shock gave way to something softer, warmer. Samuel's eyes widened in surprise. Then his expression shifted, understanding dawning. He recognized her strategy, a practical solution to silence the gossips, but something in his face suggested the proposition might not be unwelcome for other reasons. Miss Gray, he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth meant only for her, I would be honored. Mrs. Hargrove rose halfway from her seat, face mottled with anger. This is preposterous. You can't seriously. I believe, Mayor Fleming interrupted, bringing his gavel down with decisive force, that this resolves the matter of propriety. As for the educational content, he looked around the room, taking the temperature of the gathered townspeople. Let's put it to a vote. All those in favor of retaining Miss Gray as our teacher, with the understanding that parents may review educational materials if they wish. Hands rose throughout the room. Most of the parents, Dr. Wilson, the Petersons, even Pastor Williams. Eleanor counted silently, hardly daring to breathe. Those opposed. Mrs. Hargrove's hand shot up, followed by Mr. Hartford's and a few others. Fewer than a dozen in all. Then it's settled, the mayor declared, satisfaction evident in his voice. Miss Gray stays, and apparently, we'll be having a wedding to celebrate. The tension in the room broke like a fever, conversation erupting as people rose from their seats. Some approached Eleanor with congratulations. Others simply nodded as they passed. Mrs. Hargrove swept out without a word, but Mr. Hartford lingered, his expression unreadable. Miss Gray, he said stiffly when the crowd around her had thinned. It seems I underestimated you. It seems you did, she replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. He glanced at Samuel, who stood protectively at Eleanor's side. Cooper's a good man, steady. A flicker of something, regret, chagrin, crossed his features. I wish you happiness. With that, he turned and left, his expensive boots echoing on the wooden floor. Outside the town hall, snow was falling again. Fat, wet flakes that signaled winter's last gasp before spring. The crisp air filled Eleanor's lungs as she breathed deeply, feeling as though she'd been holding her breath for months. Samuel offered her his arm, which she took with only slight hesitation. Abby skipped ahead of them, throwing snowballs at fence posts and chattering excitedly about the wedding. "Did you mean it?" Samuel asked quietly, once they were beyond earshot of the dispersing. A single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching the small silver hairpin in Eleanor's trembling hands, her mother's last gift. The April morning sparkled with fresh promise as wildflowers dotted the prairie surrounding Silver Creek like scattered gemstones. Birds sang their approval as Eleanor stood before the cracked mirror in Mrs. Peterson's spare bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her. "You look beautiful," whispered Abby, eyes wide with wonder as she helped arrange Eleanor's hair. "Pa won't be able to speak when he sees you." The dove-gray silk dress rustled softly as Eleanor turned. Not white. She had insisted on that, but trimmed with delicate embroidery that Mrs. Peterson had stayed up 3 nights to finish. The older woman had become an unexpected ally, defending Eleanor fiercely at church socials when whispers arose about the hasty engagement. "Something borrowed," Mrs. Peterson said, fastening a pearl brooch at Eleanor's collar. "My mother wore it at her wedding 50 years ago." Outside, the church bell began to toll, sending butterflies swarming through Eleanor's stomach. Was she truly about to marry a man she'd known barely 3 months? A practical arrangement that had somehow blossomed into something neither had expected? "Ready?" Mrs. Peterson asked gently. Eleanor touched her scar, the familiar gesture now more habit than shame. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely audible. Mrs. Peterson squeezed her hand. "Love is always frightening, dear. That's how you know it's real." The walk to the church felt dreamlike. Townsfolk paused their Saturday errands to watch, some nodding respectfully, others merely curious. Eleanor spotted Mrs. Hargrove outside the general store, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Beside her stood Mr. Hartford, whispering something that made the older woman frown deeper. "Don't mind them," Mrs. Peterson murmured. "Some people can't recognize happiness unless it matches their idea of how it should look." The church doors stood open, sunlight streaming across worn wooden pews adorned with sprigs of early wildflowers. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, heart pounding. What if Samuel had changed his mind? What if this was all an elaborate jest? Then she saw him, tall and straight-backed at the altar, his Sunday suit brushed clean of forged dust, his dark beard freshly trimmed. But it was his expression that caught her breath, the mixture of nervousness and joy and something deeper that made her feet move forward of their own accord. Pastor Williams smiled broadly as Eleanor approached. The congregation, nearly the entire town, rose respectfully. Eleanor spotted Thomas Hargrove giving her a small thumbs up from beside his scowling mother. Mayor Fleming nodded approvingly. Little Sarah Miller waved excitedly from her mother's arms. But Eleanor saw only Samuel and Abby, waiting for her at the altar like a vision of the family she'd never dared hope for. "Who gives this woman?" Pastor Williams asked as tradition demanded. A moment of silence fell, the awkward gap where a father should speak. Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks. Then a voice rang out from the front pew. "Her students do." Mrs. Peterson stood, her gray head held high. "The children of Silver Creek give their teacher in marriage." A murmur of approval rippled through the church. Eleanor blinked back tears as several of her students called out their agreement. "Very well," Pastor Williams said with a chuckle. "Most unusual, but fitting." Samuel took her hands, his large, calloused fingers enveloping hers with surprising gentleness. "You came," he whispered, as if he too had harbored doubts. "Of course I did," she whispered back. The ceremony proceeded with the familiar rhythms of tradition, but Eleanor found surprising meaning in words she'd heard countless times before. When Samuel spoke his vows, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, she felt each promise settle into her heart like seeds finding fertile soil. "I, Samuel James Cooper, take thee, Eleanor Margaret Gray, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice carrying to the rafters. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." When her turn came, Eleanor's voice caught only once. Not from uncertainty, but from the overwhelming realization that she had found what she'd never thought possible. Not just acceptance, but genuine love. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Pastor Williams declared. "You may kiss your bride." Samuel hesitated, aware of the watching eyes. Then, with deliberate care, he traced the line of Eleanor's scar with his finger before brushing his lips against hers. A public acknowledgement that he cherished all of her, especially the parts the world had taught her to hide. The schoolhouse blazed with light and laughter as the wedding breakfast began. Women who had once whispered behind Eleanor's back now pressed slices of cake into her hands and offered advice on married life. Men who had eyed her scar with discomfort now raised glasses to Samuel's good fortune. "Mrs. Cooper," called a voice Eleanor least expected to hear. Mrs. Hargrove approached, her spine rigid as a poker. "A word, if you please." Samuel tensed beside her, but Eleanor squeezed his arm reassuringly. "Of course, Mrs. Hargrove." They stepped into the cool quiet of the schoolroom's entrance hall. Eleanor braced herself for a final cutting remark or warning. "Thomas has improved remarkably under your teaching," Mrs. Hargrove said abruptly. "His father, my late brother, was a learned man. Thomas reminds me of him when he speaks of the books you've recommended." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Thomas has a natural curiosity. It's a pleasure to nurture it." Mrs. Hargrove's lips thinned. "I wish to apologize for my hasty judgments. I was perhaps overzealous in my concerns." It wasn't a warm embrace of friendship, but it represented something significant, a grudging recognition that Eleanor had earned her place. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply. The older woman hesitated, then added, "My brother's library remains largely untouched since his passing. Perhaps some of the volumes might be useful to you and your students." Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Hargrove had swept away. Her back still ramrod straight, but her head held slightly lower. The afternoon stretched into evening as lanterns were lit and fiddles tuned. Eleanor found herself at the center of a community celebration far warmer than she could have imagined during those first lonely days in Silver Creek. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Cooper?" Samuel asked, offering his hand as the musicians struck up a waltz. "I should warn you, I'm a terrible dancer," Eleanor admitted. "Fortunately, I have sturdy boots," Samuel replied with a grin that transformed his solemn face. As he led her onto the floor, Eleanor caught sight of Abby watching them with undisguised delight. The girl had taken to the idea of Eleanor as her stepmother with enthusiasm, declaring it, "Just like in the storybooks, except better because you're smart and not just pretty." "Happy?" Samuel asked, his hand warm at her waist as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she admitted. Over his shoulder, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the schoolroom window, her scar visible in the dancing light of the lanterns. For the first time in her memory, she didn't immediately look away. As the night deepened, guests began to depart, offering final congratulations and knowing winks. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation as Samuel hitched the wagon for their short journey home. Now truly her home as well. Abby would be staying with Mrs. Peterson for 2 nights, an arrangement that brought a blush to Eleanor's cheeks whenever she thought about it. She had known marriage would include certain duties, but had never imagined she might approach them with anything other than resignation. Now, as Samuel helped her into the wagon, his hand lingering on hers slightly longer than necessary, she found herself curious instead of fearful. "Look," he said softly, pointing upward as they drove through the quiet streets. The night sky blazed with stars, more than Eleanor had ever seen in Philadelphia's smoke-filled skies. Some things can only be seen properly in darkness. Their gazes met, and Eleanor understood he wasn't speaking only of stars. At the house, their house, Samuel built up the fire while Eleanor stood awkwardly in the parlor, suddenly unsure of her place in this familiar space that was now transformed by her new role. "Tea?" she offered, falling back on the habits of hospitality. Samuel's smile was tender. "No need to be nervous, Eleanor. Nothing has to happen that you don't want." The consideration in his voice loosened something tight in her chest. "It's not that," she admitted. "It's just, I never thought I would have this. A husband. A home. She gestured to the simple but comfortable room, its walls now lined with Samuel's handcrafted shelves to hold her precious books. Someone who sees me as desirable. Samuel crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. You are the most desirable woman I have ever known, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not despite your scar, but with it. It's part of what shaped you into the woman who walked into my forge that day, the woman who saw my daughter's mind as a treasure to nurture, not just a vessel to fill with facts. Eleanor reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his beard, marveling at the right to such intimacy. You saw me when no one else did. And you saw me, a rough-hewn blacksmith with more dreams than learning, he replied. We match, Eleanor, like 2 pieces of metal forged to fit together perfectly. As his lips met hers, Eleanor felt the last of her reservations melt away. This was no mere practical arrangement, no bargain struck from necessity. This was a union of equals who had recognized in each other something precious that the world had overlooked. Later, as moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, Samuel's breathing deep and even beside her, Eleanor marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just a few short months. From rejected mail-order bride to respected teacher to beloved wife. Each step had seemed impossible until it wasn't. She touched her scar gently, remembering how Samuel had kissed it with such reverence earlier, as if it were the most beautiful part of her. Perhaps, she thought sleepily, true beauty lay not in perfection but in how completely one was seen and loved, flaws and all. Push! Dr. Simmons commanded as sweat poured down Eleanor's face. The September heat pressed against the bedroom windows like a living thing, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Eleanor screamed as another contraction tore through her body, a pain unlike anything she had ever experienced. I can't, she gasped, gripping Samuel's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. I can't do this. You can? Samuel insisted, his face pale with worry but his voice steady. You're the strongest person I know, Eleanor Cooper. Abby paced nervously in the hallway, her whispered prayers audible through the half-open door. Mrs. Peterson stood at Eleanor's other side, wiping her brow with a cool cloth and murmuring encouragement. I see the head, Dr. Simmons announced. One more big push, Mrs. Cooper. Eleanor gathered her remaining strength and pushed with everything she had, feeling as if her body might tear in two. A moment of searing pain, then blessed relief followed by the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, the indignant wail of a newborn baby. A boy, Dr. Simmons said, his usual gruff manner softening as he placed the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. A fine, healthy son. Eleanor stared in wonder at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair already showing signs of Samuel's waves. Jacob, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jacob Samuel Cooper. Samuel's face transformed with awe as he touched his son's tiny hand with one roughened finger. Jacob, he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. For my father. Abby burst into the room, unable to contain herself any longer. Is that my brother? Can I hold him? Is he all right? Are you all right, Eleanor? The questions tumbled out in a rush of excitement, making everyone laugh despite their exhaustion. Even Dr. Simmons cracked a rare smile as he packed his instruments. Family resemblance is strong, the doctor remarked, nodding toward the baby's left cheek, where a small pink birthmark stood out against his fair skin. Not a scar like Eleanor's, but a natural distinction that somehow made her love him even more fiercely. He's beautiful, Samuel said, his voice reverent, just like his mother. 1 year and 3 months after her arrival in Silver Creek, Eleanor sat on the porch of what was now truly her home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. Baby Jacob slept peacefully in her arms, his small body warm against her heart. The Cooper house had expanded. Samuel had worked tirelessly through spring and summer to add not just a nursery, but a proper study where Eleanor could prepare her lessons without disturbing the household. Letters came on today's train, called Abby, bursting through the front door with her usual energy. At 13, She was growing tall and graceful, though still prone to forgetting her manners in moments of excitement. "One from Philadelphia for you." Eleanor shifted Jacob carefully to accept the envelope. The Philadelphia postmark gave her a strange feeling, like glimpsing a previous life through a distant window. Inside was a formal notice from the academy where she had once taught, informing her that her position had been permanently filled by a Miss Harriet Dunwoody. The news, which once would have devastated her, now felt curiously unimportant. "Bad news?" Abby asked, noting her expression. Eleanor shook her head. "No, just strange to think of the life I might have led if Mr. Hartford had found me acceptable." Abby wrinkled her nose. "Mr. Hartford is engaged to Miss Jenkins from Denver. She's 22 and has fancy dresses but can barely read. Thomas says his uncle picked her from a catalog of ladies' photographs." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. She glanced down at Jacob, this miraculous child who wouldn't exist if she had fulfilled her original purpose in coming to Silver Creek. Some rejections were blessings in disguise. The screen door creaked, and Samuel stepped out, wiping forge grime from his hands with a damp cloth. "There's my boy," he said, gently touching Jacob's downy head before dropping a kiss on Eleanor's cheek. "And my girls," he added, ruffling Abby's hair. "Pa!" Abby protested, though her smile betrayed her pleasure. "I finished my composition for the territorial essay contest. Mrs. Peterson says it's the best she's read from someone my age." "Let me guess. The importance of education for women?" Samuel asked with a knowing smile. Abby lifted her chin. "Someone has to carry on Eleanor's work. There are still people who think girls don't need to learn more than cooking and sewing." Eleanor exchanged a proud glance with Samuel. Abby had blossomed under her guidance, developing not just academic skills but a passionate belief in equality that would serve her well in the changing world. "Mrs. Hargrove asked me to tutor Thomas in Latin," Eleanor mentioned as Samuel settled beside her on the bench. "Apparently he's set on attending university in Boston." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Hargrove came to you?" "Willingly. She even complimented the new school library," Eleanor confirmed. "Said her late brother would have approved of the scientific texts she donated." "You've changed this town," Samuel said, his arm finding its natural place around her shoulders. "More books in the general store. Proper library fund started. Evening classes for the minors. Even Mayor Fleming asked me yesterday if you'd consider running for the school board." "A woman on the school board?" Eleanor laughed. "Can you imagine the scandal?" "I can imagine you doing it anyway," Samuel replied with a grin. "And succeeding brilliantly." Eleanor gazed across the street, where the new sidewalk was being laid, a project she had championed to make the town more accessible during the muddy spring season. Silver Creek was growing, changing, just as she was. "The town changed me too," she admitted, leaning against his solid warmth. "When I arrived, I thought my worth was measured by what others saw or failed to see when they looked at me. And now?" Samuel asked, his voice gentle. She considered the question, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. Jacob stirred against her breast, his tiny fist curling around a lock of her hair. "Now I understand that worth isn't something assigned by others. It's inherent, waiting to be recognized by those with eyes to see." "I saw you," Samuel said simply, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her scar, a gesture that had become one of tenderness between them. "From the first moment, I saw you." The harvest festival preparations were underway in town, visible from their vantage point on the hill. Lanterns were being strung between buildings, and the newly constructed bandstand gleamed with fresh paint. Eleanor remembered last year's festival, her first as Samuel's wife, when she had still felt like an outsider despite her marriage. Now, the thought of joining the celebrations filled her with comfortable anticipation rather than dread. "Eleanor," Abby called from inside. "Mrs. Peterson is here about the festival committee." "Coming," Eleanor called back. To Samuel, she added, "Would you take Jacob? Mrs. Peterson wants us to organize the educational display." As she transferred the sleeping baby to his father's arms, Eleanor was struck by the picture they made. Samuel's large, powerful hands cradling their son with infinite gentleness. Jacob's birthmark seemed to catch the last rays of sunlight, glowing slightly against his skin. "He'll never be ashamed of it," Samuel said, following her gaze. "We'll make sure he knows it's just another way he's special." Tears pricked unexpectedly at Eleanor's eyes. "What did I do to deserve this life?" she whispered. Samuel shook his head. "It's not about deserving, Eleanor. Love isn't earned or awarded based on merit. It's given freely, and we've given it to each other." Behind them, the train whistle sounded in the distance. The same train that had brought Eleanor to Silver Creek, desperate and alone. Now its familiar call marked the rhythm of days in a life fuller than she had ever dared to imagine. Mrs. Peterson appeared at the screen door, a list in her hand and determination on her face. "Eleanor, dear, we need to settle the question of whether to include Mr. Darwin's theories in the scientific display. Mrs. Hargrove is actually in favor, can you believe it? Says Thomas might want to demonstrate some principles." "I should rescue Mrs. Peterson from Abby's enthusiasm," Eleanor said with a laugh. "That girl has enough ideas for 10 festivals." "She gets that from you," Samuel replied. "The whole town gets stronger because you refuse to be less than who you are." Eleanor paused, struck by the truth in his words. From the moment she had stepped off that train, scarred and unwanted, she had faced each rejection not by diminishing herself but by finding new paths forward. The teaching position, the confrontation at the town hall, her proposal to Samuel. Each had required a courage she hadn't known she possessed until Silver Creek demanded it of her. She covered Samuel's hand with her own, feeling the raised edges of his burned scar against her palm. Two imperfect people who had found perfect acceptance in each other. "We should go in," she said softly. "They're waiting for us." As they rose together, Jacob still sleeping peacefully in his father's arms, Eleanor took one last look at the darkening landscape. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for being too ugly had found something far more valuable than the marriage she'd initially sought. She had found a place where she was valued for her true self, scars and all. The lights of Silver Creek twinkled on one by one, marking homes and businesses in the gathering dusk. In the distance, a new family's wagon approached, perhaps bringing another hopeful soul searching for belonging. Eleanor said a silent prayer that they would find, as she had, that true beauty lay not in perfection but in how one's unique qualities could contribute to a community. She touched the small locket at her throat, a gift from Samuel on Jacob's birth, which now held miniature portraits of her husband and children on one side and her parents on the other. Past and present, east and west, all parts of the woman she had become. "Come on, you two," Abby called impatiently. "Mrs. Peterson says we need to decide tonight about the displays." Samuel chuckled. "Our daughter has your determination." "Our daughter," Eleanor repeated, savoring the words. "Our son. Our home." In Silver Creek, Eleanor Gray Cooper had finally found where she belonged. Not despite who she was, but because of it. And in that belonging, she had discovered the true measure of her worth.